The wooden board arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in newspaper from 1987. My grandmother's estate sale had yielded mostly worthless trinkets and moth-eaten clothes, but this particular item caught my eye nestled between dusty photo albums in her attic. The Ouija board was handmade, clearly old, with letters carved deep into dark walnut and a planchette worn smooth by countless fingers. I should have left it there. The seller, a nervous woman with trembling hands, practically shoved it into my arms when I expressed interest. "Take it," she whispered, glancing around as if something might be listening. "Just be careful with it. Your grandmother, she had experiences." I laughed it off then. I was a rational person, a software engineer who dealt in logic and code. Supernatural nonsense was for horror movies and gullible teenagers. But something about the board drew me in, the craftsmanship, the weight of it, the way the wood seemed to pulse warm beneath my palms. That first night in my apartment, I set it up on my coffee table just to examine it more closely. The letters were beautifully carved, each one perfectly symmetrical. The numbers ran from 0 to 9 along the bottom, with yes and no positioned at the top corners. In the center, someone had carved a symbol I didn't recognize, a twisted spiral that seemed to draw the eye inward. I placed my fingertips on the planchette, more out of curiosity than any real belief. The wooden pointer was heavier than expected, and strangely warm. I asked aloud, feeling foolish, "Is anyone there?" Nothing happened for several minutes. Just as I was about to give up, the planchette jerked beneath my fingers. Yes. My heart hammered against my ribs. I must have moved it unconsciously. The ideomotor effect, I'd read about it. Unconscious muscle movements causing the planchette to move while the user believes they're not controlling it. Simple psychology. "What's your name?" I asked, determined to prove it was just my subconscious at work. The planchette began moving again, this time with more purpose. My fingers barely touched its surface, yet it glided across the board with fluid precision. Marian. Marian? I spoke the name aloud, and the temperature in my apartment seemed to drop 10 degrees. My breath came out in a visible puff. The planchette moved again, faster now, IVEBEENWAITING. I jerked my hands away as if the board had burned me. The apartment fell silent except for the hum of my refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. I stared at the board, my rational mind scrambling for explanations. Unconscious movement. Suggestion. The power of belief creating physical responses. But my apartment was still cold, and I could swear I smelled something floral, old perfume, like roses left too long in water. I packed the board away that night, shoving it into my bedroom closet behind winter coats and boxes of old textbooks. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The name Marian echoed in my head as I tried to sleep, and I found myself wondering who she had been. How long had she been waiting? The dream started that very night. I was walking through a house I didn't recognize, but somehow knew intimately. Dark hallways stretched before me, lit only by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on peeling wallpaper. I could hear someone crying, a woman's voice, full of anguish and rage. "Find me," the voice whispered. "Find me and set me free." I would wake gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the smell of roses thick in my nostrils. During the day, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a flash of white dress, a pale hand reaching around corners. But when I turned to look, nothing was there. By the third night, I couldn't resist any longer. I retrieved the board from my closet and set it up again, my hands shaking as I placed my fingers on the planchette. "Marian?" I called softly. "Are you there?" The response was immediate, the planchette moving so quickly I could barely keep up. YESIMHEREIMALWAYSHERE. "What do you want from me?" HELPMEFINDMYBODY. The room grew colder, and this time I could see my breath clearly. The lights flickered, and somewhere in the apartment, a door slammed shut. "Your body? What happened to you?" MURDEREDBURIEDFORGOTTEN. "Who murdered you?" The planchette began moving erratically, jerking back and forth between letters so fast I couldn't follow. Then, suddenly, it flew off the board entirely, clattering against the wall with enough force to leave a dent in the drywall. The lights went out. In the darkness, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving from my bedroom toward the living room where I sat frozen. They stopped just behind my chair. I could feel a presence there, cold and hungry and infinitely patient. "You opened the door," a voice whispered directly into my ear, so close I felt the breath that shouldn't exist. "Now you must pay the price." I lunged for the light switch, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When the lights came back on, I was alone. But written in the dust on my coffee table, in elegant script, were the words, "Find me or I'll find you." I should have destroyed the board then. Burned it, thrown it away, donated it back to someone else's estate sale. Instead, I found myself researching, spending hours online searching for any information about a woman named Marion who had been murdered. The search led me to newspaper archives from the 1950s, and there she was, Marion Blackwood, age 24, reported missing in October 1954. Her disappearance had made headlines for weeks. She was beautiful, with dark hair and sad eyes that seemed to stare directly at me through the decades-old photograph. According to the articles, Marion had been having an affair with a married man, a prominent businessman whose name was never revealed in the press. She'd threatened to expose him unless he left his wife. 3 days later, she vanished. Her car was found abandoned by the river, but her body was never recovered. The case went cold within 6 months. The articles mentioned that Marion had been interested in spiritualism and had frequently attended seances. In one interview, her sister mentioned that Marion had owned a handmade Ouija board that she'd used to contact spirits. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was holding. This was her board. And somehow, her spirit was trapped within it. That night, I didn't even try to resist. I set up the board with trembling fingers and waited. "Marion? I found information about you." "About what happened?" The planchette moved slowly, almost hesitantly. "YESYOUKNOW. Who killed you? What was his name?" "RICHARDSTONE. The name meant nothing to me, but I wrote it down anyway." "Where is your body, Marion?" "CELLAROLDHOUSEMAPLESTRET. Which house? What number?" The planchette began moving faster. 147 HEBURIEDMEUNDERFLOOR. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want me to do?" "BRINGMEHOMEGIVEMEPACE. I can't just dig up someone's basement. That's breaking and entering. That's..." The planchette flew across the room again, this time shattering against the window. The glass spiderwebbed but didn't break. In the sudden silence that followed, I heard something that made my soul freeze, the sound of laughter, low and cruel and definitely not Marion's. The lights began flickering rapidly, like a strobe. In the intermittent illumination, I saw shapes moving in the shadows, tall, dark figures that seemed to bend at impossible angles. They were everywhere, standing in corners, lurking behind furniture, pressing against the walls like living shadows. "You invited us in," one of them hissed, its voice like grinding stone. "The board is a doorway, and you left it open." I scrambled for the light switch, but the bulbs exploded in showers of sparks as soon as I touched it. In the darkness, cold hands grabbed at me from all directions. I fought my way to the kitchen, fumbling for the flashlight I kept in the junk drawer. The beam of light revealed my apartment transformed into something from a nightmare. The walls were covered in symbols carved deep into the drywall, the same twisted spiral from the center of the board, repeated hundreds of times. Dark stains that looked suspiciously like blood dripped from the ceiling. And standing in my doorway was a figure in a rotting wedding dress, her face a mass of decay. But it wasn't Marion. This thing wore her form like a mask, and behind the familiar features lurked something ancient and hungry. "You thought she was alone," the thing that pretended to be Marion said, its voice a parody of the gentle whisper I'd heard before. "You thought you were helping her. But the board doesn't just hold one spirit, boy. It holds all of us. All the lost souls who've touched it over the decades. And now it holds you too." I ran. I burst through my apartment door and fled down the hallway, not caring who saw me or what they thought. Behind me, I could hear laughter echoing from my apartment, growing louder and more distorted until it sounded like a chorus of the damned. I spent that night in a 24-hour diner, drinking coffee and trying to convince myself I was losing my mind. Psychological break. Stress-induced hallucinations. Carbon monoxide leak. Anything but the truth that I was beginning to accept. When I finally returned the next morning, my apartment looked normal. The walls were unblemished, the windows intact. The only evidence of the previous night's horror was the Ouija board, which sat innocently on my coffee table with a note written in that same elegant script: "You can't run from what lives inside you now." I tried to go back to work, to resume my normal life, but it was impossible. The spirits followed me everywhere. They whispered in my ear during meetings, moved objects when I wasn't looking, made my computer screen flicker with messages spelled out in corrupted code. At night, the dreams grew worse. I was no longer just walking through the unknown house, I was living Marion's final moments. I felt her terror as Richard Stone struck her down in a jealous rage. I experienced her desperation as he dragged her unconscious body to the cellar of his family's old house on Maple Street. I felt the cold earth as he buried her beneath the stone floor, her wedding dress, the one she'd worn hoping he'd finally leave his wife, becoming her shroud. But the dreams didn't end with her death. They continued, showing me the decades that followed. Stone had kept her board, unable to throw it away but afraid to use it. When he died in 1967, his son inherited the house and everything in it. The board had passed from hand to hand ever since, collecting spirits like a magnet attracts metal. Each person who used it became a doorway for the entities trapped within. Some, like Marion, had been human once. Others were things that had never walked the earth in flesh, ancient presences that fed on fear and despair. And now I had become their newest doorway. I researched 147 Maple Street and found it was still standing, though it had changed hands many times over the decades. The current owners were an elderly couple named Henderson who had lived there for 15 years. They had no idea what lay beneath their basement floor. I knew I had to go there. The spirits gave me no choice. They haunted my every waking moment, making my life a living hell until I agreed to do what Marion had asked. But I also knew it wasn't really Marion asking anymore. She had been consumed by the darker entities long ago, her identity subsumed into the collective hunger that inhabited the board. I went to 147 Maple Street on a Thursday evening, when the shadows were long and the light was fading. The house was a modest Victorian, well-maintained but somehow oppressive. Even from the sidewalk, I could feel the weight of its history pressing down on me. Mrs. Henderson answered the door, a kind-faced woman in her 70s who invited me in when I spun a story about researching the house's history. Her husband was watching television in the living room, and the normalcy of the scene made what I was planning seem even more insane. "Oh yes, this house has quite a history," Mrs. Henderson said, leading me to the kitchen for tea. "We've always felt there was something special about it. Sometimes we hear footsteps at night, but we just assume it's the old pipes settling." I managed to keep up polite conversation while my eyes searched for access to the basement. The door was in the kitchen, painted white and unremarkable. As Mrs. Henderson bustled about preparing tea, I felt a cold presence press against my back. "Do it now," Marion's corrupted voice whispered in my ear. "They're old. They won't fight back." The suggestion horrified me. I wasn't a killer. I wasn't going to hurt innocent people to satisfy the demands of parasitic spirits. But as I tried to refuse, pain exploded through my skull. I doubled over, gasping, as invisible claws raked across my mind. "You belong to us now," the collective voice hissed. "You will do as we command, or we will make your suffering eternal." The pain intensified until I could barely think. Mrs. Henderson was asking if I was all right, her voice seeming to come from very far away. I looked up at her through tears of agony and saw her expression change from concern to fear. Whatever she saw in my face made her take a step backward. "I think you should leave," she said quietly, her hand moving toward the phone. The pain vanished suddenly, leaving me clear-headed and desperate. "Please," I gasped. "You have to listen to me. There's something in your basement. Something that's been there since 1954. I can help you get rid of it, but you have to trust me." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw her weighing options: call the police, scream for her husband, or listen to the obviously disturbed man in her kitchen. Something in my expression must have convinced her I wasn't dangerous, because she slowly nodded. "What kind of something?" she asked, I told her everything. About the board, about Marion, about the murder and the burial. She listened without interruption, her face growing paler with each word. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Harold," she called to her husband. "Could you come in here, please?" Mr. Henderson appeared in the doorway, a large man with gentle eyes who looked between his wife and me with confusion. Mrs. Henderson quickly explained what I'd told her, and I watched his expression change from skepticism to something approaching belief. "We've lived here 15 years, he said slowly. "Strange things have happened. Doors opening by themselves. Cold spots. And there's always been something wrong with the basement. It floods sometimes, even when there's no rain. And the smell." Mrs. Henderson nodded. "Like flowers. Old flowers, rotting." They helped me carry a sledgehammer and pickaxe from their garage down to the basement. The stone floor was old and uneven, covered in decades of dust and debris. But in one corner, the stones looked different, newer, laid in a slightly different pattern. As we approached that corner, the temperature dropped dramatically. Our breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of our flashlights, something laughed. "She's here," Mrs. Henderson whispered, her voice trembling. "I can feel her." I raised the sledgehammer, and the house began to shake. Not an earthquake, something else entirely. The walls groaned and creaked as if the building itself was in pain. Dust rained from the ceiling, and in the distance, we could hear the sound of breaking glass. "Do it quickly," Mr. Henderson urged. "Before whatever's up there gets worse." I brought the hammer down on the stones with all my strength. The first blow opened a crack, and a smell rose from beneath, not just decay, but something far worse. The stench of evil, of hatred left to fester for decades. The second blow opened the crack wider, and a pale hand shot up through the gap, grasping at the air with fingers like broken twigs. Mrs. Henderson screamed and stumbled backward, but her husband caught her arm and held her steady. "Keep going," he said grimly. "We've come this far." I struck again and again, breaking through the stone barrier that had hidden Marion Blackwood's grave for 70 years. Each blow was met with more supernatural fury, lights exploded, the house shook harder, and the temperature continued to drop until ice began forming on the walls. When I finally broke through completely, we stared down into a shallow grave that held the remains of a young woman in a moldering wedding dress. She had been beautiful once, but death and time had not been kind. Her skull was caved in on one side, evidence of the blow that had killed her. But even as we stared at her earthly remains, I could feel her spirit hovering nearby, no longer trapped but not yet free. The board had corrupted her, changed her from a victim seeking justice into something that fed on the pain of others. She had used me to find her body, but that wasn't the end of her plan. "Now you must take my place," her voice whispered, and I felt cold hands wrap around my throat. "One soul must remain to guard the board. To keep the others contained." I struggled against her grip, but she was stronger than death itself. The Hendersons watched in horror as I fought against an invisible assailant, gasping for air that wouldn't come. My vision began to darken at the edges, and I felt myself being pulled toward the open grave. In that moment of desperation, I remembered something from my research. Marion hadn't been evil when she died. She had been a victim, a young woman in love who had made the mistake of trusting the wrong man. Somewhere beneath the corruption was still a spark of who she had been. "Marion," I gasped, using what little breath I had left. "You don't have to do this. You can be free. Really free. Let go of the hatred. Let go of the board." The hands around my throat loosened slightly. "I can't," she whispered, and for the first time, her voice sounded human again. "I've been trapped so long. The board. It changes you. Makes you hungry. Then we destroy it," I said. "We destroy it together." For a moment, I thought she might refuse. The darkness around us seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and I could sense the other spirits trapped within the board fighting against her. They wanted her to remain corrupted, to keep feeding them fresh victims. But something in my words must have reached the woman she had been before death and decades of supernatural prison had changed her. The cold hands released me entirely, and I felt her presence step back. "Yes," she whispered. "End it. Please." I climbed out of the basement, leaving the Hendersons to call the police about the body we'd discovered. They would have a lot of explaining to do, but somehow I knew they would be all right. Marion's spirit had moved on, and the house would finally be at peace. But I still had one more task to complete. I drove back to my apartment with the Ouija board in my trunk, knowing what I had to do. The board had to be destroyed, but not in any ordinary way. Fire wouldn't work. I'd tried that before I knew what I was dealing with. Neither would breaking it apart or throwing it away. The spirits would simply migrate to the pieces or find their way back. No, it had to be destroyed in a place of power, somewhere that could contain the entities long enough for them to be banished permanently. I took it to the old church where my grandmother had worshipped, a Gothic stone building that had stood for over a century. The priest was initially reluctant to perform what he called folk magic, but when I told him about Marion and the other spirits, something in my desperation convinced him. We set up in the sanctuary at midnight, with holy water and prayers in Latin that I didn't understand but could feel the power of. The board fought us every step of the way, windows shattered, candles were extinguished by supernatural winds, and the temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the pews. But as the priest continued his prayers, I felt the entities weakening. One by one, they were being pulled away from our world, banished to whatever realm they had originally come from. Some went quietly, their long imprisonment finally at an end. Others fought with the fury of the damned, their screams echoing through the sanctuary until the windows rattled. Marion was the last to go. As her spirit finally separated from the board that had held her for so many years, she appeared to me one final time, not as the corrupted thing she had become, but as the young woman she had been. Beautiful and sad, but at peace. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she was gone. The board crumbled to dust in my hands, and the church fell silent. That was 3 months ago. I've moved to a new apartment, changed jobs, and started seeing a therapist who specializes in trauma recovery. I tell her about nightmares and stress-related hallucinations, and she nods sympathetically while prescribing sleep aids and coping strategies. I don't tell her about the spirits I still sometimes see in the corner of my vision, or the way electronic devices still malfunction around me sometimes. Some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed again. The board is gone, but the experience has left marks on my soul that I don't think will ever fully heal. But Marion is at peace now, and that has to be enough. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder about the other people who owned the board over the decades. How many others like me were drawn in by curiosity and trapped by forces they couldn't understand? How many paid the ultimate price for their contact with the supernatural? I survived, but I was lucky. I had help from the Hendersons, from the priest, and ultimately from Marion herself. Others weren't so fortunate. If you ever find yourself face to face with a Ouija board, especially an old one with a history you don't know, my advice is simple: walk away. Don't touch it, don't use it, don't even bring it into your home. The spirits that inhabit such objects are not party tricks or harmless entertainment. They are parasites, feeding on human fear and desperation, growing stronger with each soul they corrupt. I learned that lesson the hard way. I opened a door that should have stayed closed, and I'm still dealing with the consequences. Some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, and some curiosities are too costly to satisfy. The board is gone now, reduced to dust and scattered to the wind. But somewhere out there, I know there are others. Waiting in antique shops and estate sales, calling to the curious and the skeptical alike. Don't listen to their call. Some doors are meant to stay closed forever. The price of opening them is more than any mortal soul can bear. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button and share it with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey.